We had no intention of attacking Ukraine, but if it did happen, we'd only need 72 hours to take control of Kyiv and change the ruling regime. Those were the statements made by the Russian media before the special military operation. This was enough to show the overwhelming power and well-founded confidence of the Russians. And then they started the war, with the landing at Antonov Airport, a classic decapitation attack strategy used since the Soviet era. This was a consequence of a long process. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 gave birth to 15 independent countries, including the Soviet Socialist Republic of the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of Ukraine. Each country chose its own separate path, and the conflict of interest gradually became deeper. Russia wanted Ukraine to be neutral, under Moscow's control, while Ukraine wanted its own independent and self-sufficient path. They wanted to reclaim the Crimean Peninsula and the lands that the separatists wanted to secede from. Furthermore, they wanted the protection of NATO's umbrella. This was the straw that broke the Russian vodka bottle. And then, what had to happen, happened. At 5 a.m., just minutes after President Vladimir Putin announced the special military operation, a gift of more than 100 cruise and ballistic missiles was express shipped to Ukraine's military bases via air and ground launchers. The war had officially begun. At Antonov Airport, the focal point of the first days of the war, both Ukraine and Russia fought fiercely to seize the location. Antonov Airport is an international airport and test facility built by the Soviets in 1959. It includes 2 hangars with an enclosed heating system for maintenance and repair, along with several administrative and research buildings. The special feature is its reinforced concrete runway, which is 3,500 meters long and 56 meters wide. It's very suitable for landing heavy aircraft like the IL-76. More importantly, the airport is only 28 kilometers northwest of the capital, Kyiv. This was the key that would determine the survival of the Kyiv government in the first days of the war. As for Russia, they were trying to seize the airport to establish an airlift. Then they'd airlift thousands of paratroopers and armored vehicles, which were ready in Belarus, to launch a decapitation strike, capturing or eliminating the entire Ukrainian government cabinet and ending the war in a short time. Basically, the battle for Antonov Airport was divided into 2 phases. Phase 1 took place on February 24th, and Phase 2 lasted from February 25th until the end of March 29th. At 6 a.m. on February 24th, during the first hours of the war, a Caliber missile from a series of missiles attacking Kyiv unexpectedly veered off towards the Hostomel area. Its real target was the military base of the Ukrainian National Guard, located 10 kilometers from Kyiv. The missile exploded on the training ground next to the barracks and caused no casualties. Just minutes later, another one fell right next to a residential building nearby. These were the first signals of a fierce and significant war. The goal of the 2 missiles was to neutralize Military Base 3018, the force directly protecting Antonov Airport. However, an hour earlier, at around 5 a.m., the Ukrainian National Guard, with 120 conscripts from the 4th Special Rapid Reaction Brigade, the original targets of the missile attack, had moved towards the airport after receiving intelligence from the U.S. This allowed them to avoid Russia's initial surprise attack. This force quickly established defensive positions under the command of a 35-year-old officer named Vitaly. They were only equipped with some old Soviet-era shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles and a Zu-23-223mm cannon used for anti-aircraft and infantry suppression. The rest were just personal weapons. This force mainly consisted of battalions in charge of logistics and clerical work, not combat, because the elite members of the National Guard trained by NATO had been sent to the eastern fronts earlier. Due to the small number of soldiers, they couldn't establish defensive perimeters around the large airport. Officer Vitaly divided the soldiers into small teams, spreading them out around the airport and moving them in available military vehicles. They would have to hold out for 4 hours before more reinforcements from the 4th Special Rapid Reaction Brigade arrived. They were joined by some smaller National Guard units, such as the 1st Operational Brigade and the Omega Special Counter-Terrorism Unit, bringing the total defending force at the airport to more than 200 people. At this point, they also had some armored vehicles, but their basic weapons were the same as the forces already there. At the same time, 170 kilometers from Antonov Airport, Russian helicopters were preparing to take off from a Belarusian airfield. In the first wave of attack, a total of 34 Mi-8 transport helicopters carrying 300 paratroopers from the VDV airborne forces, escorted by 10 Ka-52s and some older helicopters like the Mi-24 and Mi-28. These were soldiers from the 11th and 30th Guards Airborne Assault Brigades, the most elite warriors among the elite forces. They'd always been at the forefront and fought in the most brutal battles, such as the Chechen War and the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. When entering Ukraine, this unit was helicopter transported in 2 waves. The Russian helicopter waves took off towards the Ukrainian border. Ukraine had stationed 2 anti-aircraft radar systems there. Although the missiles from Russia's initial strike had cleared this base, to ensure the absolute secrecy of the plan until the last minute, the Russian pilots had the helicopters fly close to the water along the Dnieper River. At around 9:30 a.m., they crossed the border undetected and continued south along the river. Near the hydropower plant, they turned right to avoid the anti-aircraft radar complex stationed there. However, they were still discovered. A shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile was launched, hitting one of the Ka-52s and forcing it to make an emergency landing. Another missile continued towards an Mi-24, tearing it apart, causing it to crash and disappear into the calm lake. The remaining aircraft continuously released flares and flew straight towards the airport. At 10:30 a.m., the first group of Russian helicopters arrived at the airport with the loss of 2 aircraft. Russian commanders had assured them that Ukrainian resistance was almost non-existent. However, it's possible they had misjudged the situation themselves. On the ground, Vitaly had his unit arrange cars and trucks to cover the runway. This ensured that Russia could only land NL-76 aircraft after Ukraine stopped resisting, and the Russian soldiers could clear the runway. However, this is also very difficult because they do not have the machinery to support moving tractor-trailers weighing tens of tons on the runway. To the north of the airport, Vitaly deployed about 20 soldiers to protect the radar cluster and equipped them with Zu-23-2 artillery systems. The rest of the troops were scattered at the other end of the airport and only had some outdated, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles and rifles. At 11 a.m., the battle officially began. After receiving intelligence from an airport employee who had been bribed by the Russian security agency, the Russian helicopters split into 2 groups. One group advanced to the north, trying to eliminate the 20 soldiers and the cannon there. Meanwhile, the second group advanced south of the airport to attack, push the Ukrainian forces away from the airport, and attempt to land. Russian aircraft fired rockets and machine guns. Mi-8 troop transport helicopters were only equipped with light machine guns. They fired and provided fire support for the landing. On the ground, the Ukrainian soldiers opened fire with everything they had. Soldier Sergei Fatalik used a shoulder-fired missile to hit the tail of a Ka-52, causing it to catch fire and crash onto the runway, creating another obstacle. As the battle continued, a Russian Su-24 arrived to provide support, but its effectiveness was limited. The fighting went on, and 3 more Ka-52s and 1 Mi-24s were shot down, crashing next to the runway and in a nearby field. A damaged Mi-8 was forced to make an emergency landing on the runway. The Russian soldiers then destroyed it to prevent it from being captured, causing black smoke to rise. The rockets hit the airport's fuel tanks, and black smoke covered the runway, reducing the visibility for the Russian pilots during combat and landing. After the battle lasted for another hour, the Ukrainian National Guard soldiers started running out of ammunition and were ordered to retreat to the barracks. This made it easy for Russia to land the Mi-8s and deploy their entire elite force. The soldiers in the northern part of the airport were not supported when the VDV soldiers deployed with grenade launchers and mortars. They were overwhelmed by the blitz-like attack and quickly surrendered, becoming the first prisoners of war captured by Russia. The Zu-23-2 cannon crew was also captured by Russia and used for the airport's defense in the later stages. At least 100 people from the 31st Guards Airborne Assault Brigade were deployed in the first wave. They quickly seized positions on the main runway, but couldn't immediately enter the airport buildings. They waited for the second Mi-8 group to land, raising the total number of troops to 300. At this point, they began to attack the control tower and the administrative buildings. Overwhelmed in terms of numbers, combat skills, and depleted ammunition, the National Guard forces retreated to their base. However, a small team was determined to stay and hold off the Russian forces with the scarce ammunition left behind by their comrades. No matter how high the morale of these logistics soldiers was, they could not stop the well-trained and combat-hardened Russian VDV force. By 1 p.m., all resistance efforts had been crushed. The Russian flag was raised, and the entire airport fell into Russian hands. Thus, Russia had initially succeeded in taking the airport, although the losses were beyond what they had expected. It took them 2 hours, so the element of surprise was gone, because the airport's defending forces had resisted more strongly and were more organized than they had thought. However, it seemed that the VDV soldiers didn't yet know that the real battle had just begun. On one hand, Ukraine withdrew the 4th Special Rapid Reaction Brigade and the airport's defense units to resupply ammunition and reorganize their forces. On the other hand, they urgently airlifted the 81st and 95th Separate Airborne Assault Brigades from Zhytomyr by helicopter to the airport. At the same time, the factor that helped Ukraine turn the tide was the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, stationed in Bilatserkva. Equipped with heavy artillery and T-64 tanks, this brigade was also urgently moved to the airport to prepare for a counterattack. On the other side, the Russians were also racing against time. The Il-76 transport aircraft began to take off while the VDV forces tried to clear the runway. If the Il-76 transport aircraft could land successfully, bringing in a large number of elite forces and armored vehicles, the Ukrainian Rapid Reaction Forces would not be able to save the situation, even if they arrived. A more brutal battle was about to take place. Immediately after the airport fell into Russian hands, 2 units, the 81st and 95th Separate Airborne Assault Brigades, arrived near the airport, combining with the withdrawn 4th Special Rapid Reaction Brigade. However, they didn't immediately launch a counterattack to retake the airport because they didn't have heavy weapons for support. This was also partly because Ukraine knew the force they were facing wasn't easy to fight, even though their current numbers were several times that of the enemy. Instead of attacking immediately, these units urgently trained ordinary citizens and volunteer veterans to use rifles to support the counterattack. Their main intention was to wait for the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, which was in Bilatserkva, 100 kilometers from the airport, to move its tanks, armored vehicles, and heavy artillery. Unlike the 85th and 95th Separate Airborne Assault Brigades, which were airlifted to the airport by helicopter, this unit had to move its tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery by road, which was much more difficult. Fortunately, some citizens used commercial trucks to help them transport troops and weapons. In this situation, time is of the essence. Meanwhile, the Russian VDV forces began clearing the runway and strictly guarding the airport until the Il-76 aircraft could land successfully. Due to their small numbers, they couldn't continue to attack outside the airport. This gave Ukraine time to deploy artillery in advantageous positions to support the counterattack. At this point, the Russian forces were in a precarious situation because they had no long-range weapons, artillery, or tanks. The helicopters that had supported them in the attack had returned to Belarus to resupply ammunition and fuel. They were only very limitedly protected by two Su-25 ground attack aircraft, and mainly had personal weapons along with a captured Zu-23-2 cannon with a range of 3,000 meters. At 3:30 p.m., Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the nation. He announced that the encirclement of the airport was complete and gave the order to attack.
Ворожений десант в Гостомелі блокують. Війська отримали наказ на знищення.
Almost simultaneously, the artillery of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade began shelling the airport. It's estimated that in this battle, Ukraine had nearly an artillery battalion with 15 heavy artillery pieces and BM-21 multiple rocket launchers with calibers from 122 to 152 millimeters. This figure does not even include the mortars from squad to brigade level that rained down on the airport. Two Su-24 ground attack aircraft, supported by a MiG-29 fighter jet, also dropped bombs from the air on the Russian positions. It seemed the Ukrainian military command had realized the plan behind Russia's seizure of the airport. Therefore, they had their artillery and ground attack aircraft thoroughly plow the runway to the point where it couldn't be repaired quickly. After clearing the runway with artillery and air power, the Ukrainian infantry, supported by 5 tanks and some infantry fighting vehicles, began to attack from multiple directions with the support of 2 Mi-24 helicopters equipped with rockets and heavy machine guns. Notably, the counterattack was actively supported by the Georgian Legion, a unit mainly composed of ethnic Georgians who had been fighting for Ukraine since 2014. A Ukrainian soldier described fighting the Russian forces, who had no long-range weapons or air support at the airport, like playing a video game, where you just had to aim and take them down from our positions outside the airport. At this point, the Russian Il-76 aircraft, carrying airborne units with more than 1,000 soldiers and armored vehicles, had flown 2/3 of the way and had to turn back and land in Belarus because the runway was too damaged to land. The VDV units trapped inside the airport had no heavy weapons to fight back and no air support. Their only hope was to hold out long enough to wait for the infantry units that were attacking deep from Belarus to arrive, as planned by the Russians. In addition to the air reinforcements, they also had 2 ground thrusts through Chernobyl and Kyiv to provide support. According to the plan, these 2 attack thrusts would reach the airport before nightfall, because Russian intelligence had bribed some pro-Russian Ukrainian officials. Another reason was that along these 2 attack routes, Ukraine had no regular brigades for defense. However, some guerrilla units and Ukrainian civilians removed signs on the roads leading to Kyiv. They also ambushed and harassed the Russian convoys, which made the advance take much longer than planned. The plan had to change again. They asked the 2 airborne brigades trapped at the airport to hold out until the next morning, without reinforcements. As the one-sided slaughter continued for a few more hours, the VDV units couldn't hold out any longer, and the rescue force they were waiting for was still stuck in Chernobyl and Kyiv. They suffered heavy casualties after holding out for a few more hours. Taking advantage of the darkness, the remaining remnants retreated into the nearby forests and were unable to launch any more attacks. At 9 p.m., Ukraine had complete control of the airport. They raised the Ukrainian flag. The First Battle of Antonov Airport had officially ended. The Russian VDV units that participated in the battle suffered heavy casualties and were almost annihilated. This included the frontline commander of the 31st Airborne Assault Brigade, Colonel Sergei Kotosev, and the battalion commanders, Major Alexei Oskin and Lieutenant Colonel Denis Yagodarov, who were killed in action. The Russian plan was perfect. But some reasons for Russia's failure include the initial intelligence from NATO, which helped Ukraine move the 4th Special Rapid Reaction Brigade early, avoiding Russia's initial missile strike. This unit actively fought to defend the airport initially, buying time for other reinforcements. Russia's strategy was exposed because they had previously succeeded with a similar tactic. Czechoslovakia was the first victim of this strategy in 1968. Paratroopers were dropped into Prague airport to establish an airlift. Then many more paratroopers were airlifted by transport aircraft. They spread out and seized key locations in the capital, such as the radio station, army headquarters, and government buildings, taking the government cabinet into custody before they could react. This plan was repeated almost perfectly in Afghanistan in 1979, and finally took control of Crimea. This time, the main target was Sevastopol Airport. The Russians seized the peninsula with almost no casualties. Now, this strategy seems to have been exposed in Ukraine. They were also part of the former Soviet Union, the birthplace of this strategy. Another reason was that the Ukrainian National Guard forces, who initially defended the airport, were able to hold out for 2 hours, even though they were only support units and not focused on combat. Parallel to the first Battle of Antonov Airport, Russia also opened several other fronts, such as Kherson, Zaporizhia, Mariupol, Donetsk, Luhansk, and a pincer attack with 2 deep thrusts into Kyiv through the Belarus border, which we will learn about in the next parts. If you find this video helpful, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. This is completely free, but it will be a huge motivation for us to continue making more quality videos for you.